And good morning, everyone. You're very welcome to EMA. I'm very glad to be here this morning to introduce this topic. So, the Pharmaceutical Quality Office of EMA, we support all aspects of CMC lifecycle management, from the early development, scientific advice, dealing with academic and industry applicants, through the authorization process, and after approval, managing the product lifecycle. We support a number of working parties, in particular the Quality Working Party and the Biologics Working Party of the CHMP, which are responsible for assessing the CMC aspects of medicinal products coming through the centralized procedure. So the synopsis of my talk. So over the next hour, we're going to introduce ICH Q12, and this is a guideline on lifecycle management, and it shows how to define a risk-based regulatory system for oversight and communication of post-approval CMC changes. At the end of the session, so in just over an hour's time, I hope that you will be aware of and understand a number of key principles. Firstly, how post-approval CMC changes are categorized in line with their risk to quality, safety, and efficacy. How specific ICH Q12 tools can be used in lifecycle management. And examples of these tools are established conditions, post-approval change management protocols, product lifecycle management documents. And finally, the importance of an effective pharmaceutical quality system and the importance of the relationship between regulatory assessment and inspection. So I've put together this presentation. The presentation is a subset of slides taken from the official ICH Q12 training materials. The full training material presentations can be accessed on the ICH Quality Guidelines page. So if you follow the link on the screen to the Quality Guidelines page, scroll to the Q12 banner, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a link to the training materials. If you click this link, it opens a zip file which contains 8 separate modules of training material as PDF slides. Obviously, there wasn't enough time this morning in an hour to go through everything. So what you're going to see is a selected number of slides from each of the 8 modules. So at your own leisure and time later, you can go back to the ICH website and you can have access to the full training presentation, which has more detail, more examples, which you might find useful. So to kick things off then, we'd like to get an idea of who you are and what you do. So for those joining on the WebEx, you have a link to a Slido poll that's appearing in the WebEx now. And for those who are in the room or elsewhere, if you have a smartphone, you can use the smartphone to scan this QR code. So what I'd like you to do is enter the Slido poll, either via WebEx or via this QR code, and please answer the following question. So what's your current role in your agency? And this is an open poll. You can choose one or more answers. Based on the information we have, the likely, I think, roles will be quality CMC assessor, clinical, non-clinical assessor, GMP, GDP inspector, or if you work in administration or management. It may be the case that you work in management and you're also a quality assessor or an inspector. So we'd invite you all to please answer this question, so that will give us a good idea as to the positioning that we have within the room. Okay, we have a good response now. We're up to 84 replies at this stage, 86. And what I can see on the screen is that slightly over half, 52% of us in the room are quality CMC assessors, like myself. We have a quarter of the participants are GMP or GDP inspector. We have 15% of participants are in a management role. And I think that really covers the majority. And this, from my point of view, then is the perfect mix, I think, for a talk on ICH Q12, because Q12 focuses primarily on what we do as quality assessors, reviewing a CMC dossier, but also, importantly, how we interact with our colleagues who work as GMP inspectors, and how that assessment inspection interface is absolutely key as a foundation to good regulatory oversight of lifecycle management. Okay, so we go. I'm going to go to next question now. Are you involved in assessing post-approval changes or inspecting change management processes in your day-to-day work? Okay, so our response level is similar again. We're up around 80 participants, and I can see 60 to 65% of you are involved in assessing or inspecting post-approval changes as part of your day-to-day work. So again, this, I think, shows for us as regulators, whether we're working in assessment or inspection, that lifecycle management and oversight of this work by industry is a key and important part of our work. Okay, so I think we landed on 2/3, 66% are involved. So this presentation should be relevant for your work. Last one, the last Slido. I think if I can move on. This one is a little different. It's a word cloud. So within the Slido, we would ask you to open this question, and it's a free text answer. So what aspects of lifecycle management or ICH Q12 guideline do you most want to learn about today? So if you could just write a single word, what if you could get something out of the next hour and 15 minutes, what would it be? Okay, this one's taking a little bit longer. We have about 25 responses now, so we'll give it another minute or two to see what we can get. Okay, so I can see on the screen variations are mentioned as a key word, post-approval changes, how variations are managed, lifecycle management, quality. The word risk appears a couple of times, risk assessment, regulatory considerations, and transparency, which I think is a really important one that's appeared there. So maybe we'll keep this, we can keep this Slido open for a little while as we continue through the presentation, and we can look back at this word cloud towards the end to see what we've, if we've achieved our objectives. Okay, so let's move on to the presentation proper then. So thanks very much for your very engaged start. I think it's been really helpful to see the mix of people that we have in the room and the focus that we'll have for the training over the coming 2 days. So let's talk about life cycle. So the life cycle of a product or process, it starts at development and it continues during the pre and post approval phases and during commercialization, right up until when a product might be withdrawn from the market. And the ICH Q10 guideline has a nice diagram that illustrates this. So we can see along the top how the pharmaceutical product life cycle evolves from early development through technology transfer into commercial manufacturing, and in some cases to product discontinuation at the end. Investigational products are those which are used in clinical trials, and the IMPs are used during pharmaceutical development to generate the clinical data that will eventually support the marketing authorization. The GMP, the Good Manufacturing Practice Guidelines, cover everything that's done throughout the product life cycle, but in a risk proportionate way. And the GMPs, which cover final commercial manufacture, are different. They're more detailed and more stringent than those that cover the very early development and the initial clinical trial phase. What we have at the bottom of this picture here in black are the responsibilities and the actions of the marketing authorization holder and the manufacturer. And they have responsibilities to manage within their pharmaceutical quality system everything in terms of knowledge management and quality risk management that will underpin their production, their manufacturing, their testing, and ultimately ensure that the product reaching the patient is of consistent and acceptable quality. So a change, if you make a change to a manufacturing process, to a testing, to a formulation, any change is always associated with a risk. And the level of risk to a product quality when implementing a change depends to a great extent on the depth of the scientific knowledge of the medicinal product and the manufacturing process. And that knowledge is gained during development and commercial manufacturing. There's a number of key quality guidelines, notably ICHQ 8 to 11, so 8, 9, 10, and 11. And these are the basis for acquiring scientific products and process knowledge. The quality risk management approach described in ICHQ 9 underpins everything that we do in lifecycle management. So what I'm saying here really is Q12 gives you the specific tools to manage change and to assess change for approved products. But this can only be effective if you have quality risk management principles in line with ICHQ 9, a functioning pharmaceutical quality system in line with ICHQ 10, and that the pharmaceutical development has followed the guidance laid out in ICHQ 8 for finished product and Q11 for active substance. So Q12 cannot be read alone. It needs to be read in conjunction with these other quality guidelines, and indeed its content and its tools are built on the content of the other quality guidelines. So I have a slide now which is a diagram illustrating how the different elements described in Q12 can be used during the product life cycle. It applies to initial marketing authorizations, but also to commercial products where established conditions are introduced retrospectively. It's a complicated slide, and it may be hard to fully digest its content now, 10 minutes into the presentation, but I hope we can come back to this slide at the end of the presentation and that it will make some more sense, and the terms that are there will be clear to you. So yeah, as I said, it's a busy slide. It shows the different tools which we're going to talk about over the next hour. We're going to talk about established conditions and reporting categories, post-approval change management protocols, product lifecycle management document, and how these are used initially in the initial approval of the CMC part of a medicinal product, and then in post-approval, how we manage the product lifecycle, how we mitigate the risk of these changes that a manufacturer can make during their product lifecycle. You see a lot of acronyms here, which you may or may not be familiar with: ECs, PACMPs, PQS, quality system. I hope by the end of this presentation, this slide will make more sense to you, and you'll be happy to use it as you pass on this training to others in your organization. Okay, so let's move in then to the detail of the Q12 guideline. The first thing we're going to tackle is the categorization of post-approval CMC changes. This is the content of Chapter 2 of the ICH Q12 guideline. So why do we categorize variations or post-approval CMC changes? And I should note that in the EU, we use the term variations when we talk about post-approval CMC changes. So whenever I use the term variation, you can consider that I'm referring to post-approval CMC changes. So we need to categorize variations to advise and inform what regulatory action is expected in the case of that post-approval change. There needs to be a communication tool between the regulator and MA holders for managing post-approval changes based on the potential risk that change poses to quality, safety, or efficacy. So this can include the nature of the change, the conditions and documentation associated with the change, what we expect to be sent to us for review, a particular reporting category, and importantly, a time frame for evaluation or implementation. And this comes back to that important word we saw in the word cloud, which is transparency. So by having a clear system of categorization of variation, it's clear to the industry what's expected, what category of variation or submission they're expected to submit, when they are expected to submit it, what documentation they will be required to provide, and importantly, what they can expect from the regulator. What will be the time frame for the evaluation? When can they expect the opinion, the outcome, and when can they actually implement the change? So this categorization sets out a framework within which the industry and the regulators can do their work in an efficient way and in a risk proportionate way. So the rationale underpinning this is that CMC changes vary from low to high potential risk. Mostly we're talking about a risk to product quality. Also safety and efficacy are very important components, because the quality, safety and efficacy are the three pillars on which marketing authorization is built. The process of regulatory communication should be commensurate with that potential risk. So what that means is if something has little or no risk to product quality, we don't need to have a long review time with multiple assessors, rounds of questions, and a lot of detailed review. If something is of low risk to quality, possibly a notification from the manufacturer, from the MA holder to the regulator would be sufficient. In certain cases, an inspection may be needed, but that will be completely dependent on the risk that a change poses. So for example, the addition of a manufacturing site, a well-known manufacturing site based in an EU country, which has been subject to EU inspection, is certified to be GMP compliant. That may be, to add that manufacturing site to a license may represent a moderate risk to quality. Whereas to add a site in a third country outside of the EU, which hasn't been approved for an EU product before, which hasn't been inspected by an EU GMP inspectorate, there's a lot of uncertainty there. It doesn't necessarily translate into high risk, but when there's uncertainty, we need to look commensurate to the information we have in front of us and what the MA holder can show to us to categorize a variation accordingly. And in that case, a variation will probably be considered a higher risk, and actually an inspection may be needed. In fact, an inspection will be needed in that case. So Chapter 2 of Q12 describes the framework that encompasses this risk-based categorization for the type of communication expected of the MA holder with the regulatory authority. And what Q12 sets out in this Chapter 2 is the ideal of the framework for lifecycle management. So all of the member regions, the regulators of ICH, have signed up to this as the ideal categorization system. So ideally, there should be changes which require prior approval. So these are the changes with the highest risk. And then there's those changes which are moderate or low risk, which can be managed by notification. So this is, in essence, a three-tier system where you have those high-risk changes that require prior approval, moderate risk changes which they don't require prior approval, but they require notification prior to implementation. And then you have the lowest risk changes, which we call do and tell variations, where they can be implemented already by the MA holder and communicated to the regulator within 12 months. And this risk-based categorization of changes means that as regulators, we put the appropriate resources in and the appropriate effort in to review and managing those changes which present the highest risk to quality, safety and efficacy, and ultimately to patients. That's not to say that changes that don't require variations don't require any action. The responsibility is squarely on the manufacturers and the MA holders to manage and record all changes within their quality system. So anytime a manufacturer changes something, an input material, a supplier, a manufacturing process, this needs to be captured within their quality system and may be verified on routine inspection. A subset of those changes require to be communicated to the regulator as variations. And what a risk-based classification system does is it provides that transparency and clarity to the MA holders and manufacturers as to which changes require communication with the regulator and what level of effort they need to put into that, how detailed the procedures for assessment will be, and crucially, what the expected timelines for the review will be. So if we look at this table here, we can see the three-tiered system of high, moderate and low risk changes. So in the EU, we call them variations, and we use the terminology type 2 for a prior approval variation, type 1B for a moderate notification, and type 1A for a low risk notification. You'll see across the world, other regulators have a similar three-tier system for classifying changes. They have different names. So I think in the US, a prior approval supplement is the equivalent of a type 2 prior approval. Then they have change being affected in 30 days, similar to a 1B, change being affected 0 days, similar to a notification low, and they have the annual report. In the EU, we have two types of type 1A, a minor notification which needs to be communicated within 12 months of implementation, which is similar to the FDA's annual report, and a type 1A immediate notification, which needs to be notified to the regulator within 14 days. So you can see within this system, this system of categorization gives a clear instruction to the industry and a clear outline in terms of expectations on procedures to be followed, timelines, and the complexity of these regulatory procedures commensurate to the risk that's posed by the change. Underpinning everything, of course, is the quality system, and all changes should be recorded in the quality system, regardless of whether they trigger a variation or not. So, in conclusion, on Chapter 2, to achieve the objectives of lifecycle management in Q12, and I think this is really important because it's the bedrock of all the other tools. The most important step is to establish a risk-based categorization system for post-approval changes. And I think in terms of what we've agreed globally for human medicines through Q12, a 3-tiered system that addresses high, moderate and low risk changes is seen as the model that should be pursued and implemented by medicines regulators. If we use a 3-tiered risk-based categorization system, this will promote transparency and predictability, both for the industry and for us as regulators. So I have another slide on now for you to reflect on what we've talked about there in the last 10 minutes. So do you have currently a 3-tiered system for risk-based categorization of post-approval changes according to their risk? So there's a couple of options here. Yes, we have a 3-tiered system fully in line with Q12. Yes, we have a risk-based system, but there are some differences. No, we don't have such a system, but we plan to implement it. Or no, we don't have a system and we don't plan to implement it. So if I could ask you to please tick the box. Okay, thanks. So we've almost 70 replies here. So we have 39% who have indicated yes, fully in line. So your variation system is fully in line with this chapter of Q12, which is really excellent. We're very happy to hear that. And then we have 30%, well, 29, 27%. Yes, we have a risk-based system, but with some differences. No, we don't, but we plan to implement. So I think it was only 6% of respondents have indicated that there's no plans to implement. So for me, that shows over 90% of us here either have a variation system fully in line with Q12 or are on the path to implementing a system in line with Q12. Maybe I could ask in the room if there's anyone who would like to share some of their reflections. If you're one of the maybe one of the countries who said we have a system but with some differences, maybe you could explain what the differences are. If there's someone online or in the room would like to share that. Okay, well, maybe we can come back to that towards the end. I think we're from a training point of view, I think it would be very interesting together collectively in this room that we could share with each other current challenges and experiences. Because obviously there's 40% or a third at least here who are that bit ahead in terms of implementation of this aspect of Q12, and some who are on a different path, different place on the path. So I think if not within the session, then maybe over coffee afterwards we can further discuss these aspects. Okay, so maybe I'll move to the next slide then. It's the next chapter of Q12, what's called established conditions. So established conditions are the elements in the dossier that are considered necessary to ensure product quality. So these elements can be the manufacturing process parameters, analytical test parameters, acceptance criteria, specifications. The established conditions are the legally binding information in the dossier. And as a consequence, any change to the established conditions necessitates a regulatory action to the competent authority. So the established conditions are the information in your dossier that will trigger a variation if changed. So when we look back on chapter 2, the categorization of variations, whether or not something requires a variation or not, it depends on this chapter whether it's considered to be an established condition. So the concept of established conditions provides a clear understanding between the MA holder and the regulatory authorities regarding the elements to assure product quality, and that will trigger a regulatory communication if changed. So all submissions contain a combination of established conditions and supportive information. So most simple example would be an analytical method in a specification. So you have an assay method, which say your assay limit is 95 to 105%, and you have a HPLC method which has its details in the dossier, its column, its mobile phase, its flow rate, temperature. So the established conditions are the limit of this test, 95 to 105. If a company wants to widen the limits to 90 to 110, for example, that would trigger a variation. The HPLC column is an established condition. If they want to use a gas chromatography or change it to a different type of method, that would require a variation. But the validation data, the analytical method validation data in the dossier, which they have submitted to demonstrate that this analytical procedure is valid and works correctly, this is supportive information. So they submit their validation report. This document is in the dossier. It shows the accuracy, precision, linearity range of their analytical method. That's supportive information. That doesn't change and it doesn't trigger a variation. So in that example, the established conditions are the limits of the test and the particularities, the technology and the particularities of the analytical procedure. Now, this applies throughout the dossier to all sorts of different parts of the dossier. And knowledge gained through product lifecycle, including pharmaceutical development and characterization studies, is the basis for identifying the elements of CMC that are established conditions and those elements which are supportive information. So what's really important, I think, is that we understand that the module 3 of the CTD, the quality dossier, is very detailed. It contains a lot of information. The established conditions are that legally binding information that's absolutely essential to assure product quality. And if you change that information, you're going to trigger a variation. So again, if we look here on the Appendix 1 of the Q12 guideline, Appendix 1 is a table. It's a table of CTD Module 3 structure. It goes node by node, folder by folder, and shows the different headings. And it indicates which parts of the dossier you can expect to find established conditions and which parts of the dossier would only contain supportive information. So in the example there, you'll see, the nomenclature, the structure of the drug substance, for example. They can't change, they don't change their established conditions. If a company wants to change that, that would certainly trigger a variation. But the general properties, which are the supportive information, they don't necessarily trigger variations if they're changed. So within this table at the appendix of the Q12 guideline, you'll see the white sections are the sections where established conditions are present. The grey sections of the dossier are sections where the information is only supportive and you don't expect a variation to be triggered. So to identify the established conditions for a manufacturing process, we expect when a company is following a development in line with Q12 that they will provide a rationale for their established conditions. Depending on the development approach they've followed, these can be divided into basically two different approaches, minimal approach and enhanced approach. So if you read ICH Q8 or Q11 on pharmaceutical development of finished product or active substance, we know there's a minimal or traditional approach to pharmaceutical development, which involves limited studies and results in a limited understanding on the relationship between inputs and resulting quality attributes. So for example, following a traditional or minimal approach, a company may have developed a product at a small scale, scaled it up, maybe made a couple of commercial scale batches, and then submitted for licensing without having done a huge amount of additional studies. So that's a minimum pharmaceutical development approach. An enhanced development approach is what we sometimes refer to as quality by design. In the QBD approach, there's an increased understanding of interaction between inputs and quality attributes. And the control strategy can be more nuanced and can be set with more specific limits or ranges. And this can lead to established conditions that are more focused and refined and more focused on the important input parameters and outputs. So really, if a company does a lot of work, they do multifactorial experimentation, they look at the interaction between different parameters, they understand the impact of different manufacturing process steps on the product quality, this company would have a much better understanding of the risk posed by a change to their manufacturing process. So they may have fewer established conditions and lower reporting categories than an applicant who'd followed a minimal development approach. There's a decision tree within Q12 on identifying established conditions and the reporting categories. And this, like I said, depends on the knowledge that the applicant has gained through their pharmaceutical development, and is very much dependent on whether a minimal or an enhanced pharmaceutical development has been followed. So the first question is, does the parameter need to be controlled to ensure product quality? So is it a critical process parameter or a process parameter where an impact on quality can't be excluded? And the answer to this question is yes or no. If the answer is no, so this parameter does not need to be controlled, then it's not an established condition. It doesn't require to be reported if it's changed. It's considered to be supportive information in the dossier. Now, if the manufacturer changes this parameter, they will have to document that change in their quality system. They'll have to keep all the records, do the risk assessments, work under GMP to manage this change. But crucially, because it's not an established condition, they won't need to submit a variation to the regulator. On the other side, on the left-hand side of the decision tree, if you answer yes to the question, so does the parameter need to be controlled to ensure product quality? Yes, then it's an established condition. So we know if the company, if the industry make a change to this parameter, so for example, in our example with the assay limit, so if the assay limit is 95 to 105, if the company wants to widen that limit or tighten that limit or change that limit in any way, it will require the submission of a variation. It's an established condition. Then the next question is, what's the category of the variation? So considering the criticality assessment and the control strategy, what's the potential risk to product quality if the parameter is changed? So in our example of the assay limit of 95 to 105, if the applicant wants to widen the assay limit to 90% to 110%, what's the potential risk to product quality of having a wider assay limit? Is it high, moderate, or low? I think that the answer there is probably high, because you're introducing variability and probably there's probably a difference in impurities, and that could have an impact on both the safety and efficacy. So a widening of that established condition will be considered high risk. So that would go to the left, and we'd say that's a prior approval. If you want to widen your specifications, we need a type 2 variation. The regulator needs to assess and give you prior approval before you can implement. But what if the applicant wants to tighten their established condition? So the limit is 95 to 105, and they say we want to tighten this to 98 to 102. So this is a change in the established condition. What's the potential risk to product quality? Well, you're going to have a tighter limit on your assay. You're potentially going to have fewer fewer room for impurities, and a tighter control on the potency and the delivered dose of your medicine. So actually, the risk this poses to product quality is low. So in that case, a tightening of the established condition, if the change is moderate to low, can be managed by a notification. And this is reflected in the EU in our variation classification, where a change outside the specification range requires a type 2 variation, whereas a tightening of specifications can be done by a notification, a do and tell. So in this case, the company changes their specification in their quality system, in their day-to-day operation, from 95 into 98%. And then within 12 months, they notify us, we've made this change. It's low risk. In terms of our procedures, we document and make note of the minor type 1A notification, but that's it. We don't need to look in detail in the assessment. We focus our work, our resources, our attention onto the higher risk changes, which are the widening of specifications in that example. So in the next slides, we have some examples of how established conditions can be identified for a manufacturing process. And this slide illustrates how the development approaches, whether it's a minimal development or an enhanced development, how these can cover how these can result in different established conditions, I think, for different types of development. So what we try to show here is that increased knowledge and understanding lead to reduction of uncertainty and improved management of risk. And as a result, established conditions could become less extensive. So if we look at this slide, and I want you to think now about a manufacturing process where you have an active substance and 3 excipients, and they're blending together. So what we're talking about here is an API, 3 excipients, we're putting them in the blender, and we want to get a homogeneous blend that can go to the next step of the manufacturing. So we've a couple of key things we need to consider here. We have the material attributes, the input material attributes. So we have the particle size distribution of the active substance, the moisture content of the active substance, and the specifications of the excipients. Then we have our mixer. So in this example, we have a V blender, which is following a diffusion mixing principle, operating at a certain scale, 200 kilograms, with a blend speed of 20 revolutions per minute and a blend time of 20 minutes. And the output we want is to have a standard deviation of less than 5% in the homogeneity. So the company that's followed the minimal parameter-based approach, maybe they've only made a couple of batches, they haven't studied in great detail the particle size distribution or the impact of moisture content. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. So maybe they've run in their 3 batches, they've always run their system with a blend speed of 200 and a blend time of 20 minutes. So following that minimal approach, they know it works for these 3 batches. They know they've gotten a homogeneous blend, but they don't really know what happens outside of what they've done. So there's a couple of changes here. If they change the moisture content of the API, they haven't studied it in detail, so they don't know, will a moisture content above 1 have an impact on quality? So that will require a notification moderate. They haven't looked at different types of blenders. So if you want to change the operating principle or the equipment type, that's going to require a variation. The scale they've looked at is just 200 kilos, and they haven't varied their blend speed and blend time. So following the minimal approach, their established conditions are defined. There's very few change categories at notification low. The only one that's at notification low is to tighten the particle size. Everything else is moderate or high because they don't have that detailed understanding of their product process. The company that follows the enhanced approach, so this is in the second column. So if we look here, they've actually studied the particle size distribution in a wider range 5 to 200 rather than 20 to 50. And they understand more than the first company. They understand what the impact of the PSD is on their blend output. Maybe they've studied the moisture content at 2%, at 3%, and they've actually demonstrated and shown us, actually, it doesn't matter what the moisture content is. Even when we ran the process at 2%, at 3%, we got the same blend homogeneity. So actually, we know API moisture isn't an established condition. It's not important to quality. And they only know that because they've studied it. The first company don't know. So they make an assumption that moisture may have a role, but they don't know. So it's an established condition for them. For the second company, they know it's not an established condition. And then we look at their blend speed and blend time. If they've studied a blend speed of 10 to 20 RPM and a blend time of 15 to 25 in a multifactorial way, they can have a design space and they can show that blending and time anywhere between these two ranges will always result in a homogeneous blend. So they have a much more flexible manufacturing system. And if they want to change it in the future, because they understand the risk that changes would pose, they can have lower reporting categories for these variations. And that's directly proportional to the time, the effort, and the work they've put into their pharmaceutical development. They've studied their blending unit operation in more detail. They've made more development batches. They've made more pilot scale. They've investigated the different combinations of input material, quality attributes, and they've concluded on a very clear risk-based definition of established conditions. The last column, the performance-based approach, is when, and this will be something you'd see probably used in continuous manufacturing or when PAT tools are used. In this case, if a company is using a near infrared analyzer, they can actually measure the output in real time. What is the standard deviation of my homogeneity? They can measure that in real time and ensure that that's consistently met. So in that case, they actually don't need to set established conditions for blend speed and blend time. They can just let this process run and they can adjust their blend speed and blend time so long as the output is always ensured by the NIR system. So this is, in effect, the same manufacturing process, the same blending unit operation, but from 3 different companies following different development approaches and different control strategies. Their established conditions will be different and their reporting categories for future variations will be different. But in each case, it's risk proportionate, and as a regulator, we are seeing prior approval type 2 variations only for the aspects that that pose a risk to product quality. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter now, chapter 4. We're going to talk about change management protocols. So a change management protocol is a regulatory tool to facilitate and benefit post-approval changes by providing transparency between industry and regulatory authorities and predictability regarding the acceptance and implementation of a change. So in terms of transparency, a post-approval change management protocol gives transparency to the regulator. It means we are aware about future changes. We know what the manufacturer, the MA holder, has planned, and we can assess the plan, the protocol for implementing this change in advance. And this assessment then helps us to define exactly what data we expect to see at the time of implementation of this CMC change. So within a change management protocol, the company will outline what experimental studies they intend to perform, what conditions they intend to fulfill, and what their plan is to implement this CMC change, including the variation reporting level. After it's assessed by the authorities, then it allows a timely implementation of the change and can be used multiple times for a change. So this gives the predictability. So in a normal scenario, so if we think about a new manufacturing site, so In the normal scenario where I don't have a change management protocol, I'm going to register a new manufacturing site. I have my strategy for my new site. I'm going to transfer my test methods. I'm going to transfer my manufacturing process, transfer over everything from my quality system in terms of how I manage the input materials. I'm going to manufacture a number of batches, say 3 batches. These 3 batches, I'm going to compare the results to the batches from my current manufacturing site. And then I'm going to present all the results together in a variation package to the regulator. And the assessor reviews this as a whole package. A type 2 variation, would take between 60 to 90 days to review. If they want to implement this change in multiple regions, they have to submit this variation in parallel in multiple regions. If they follow a change management protocol approach, we separate the strategy for the change from the results. So in the first submission, they submit the strategy. This is what I'm going to do. These are the tests I'm going to transfer. This is the number of batches I'm going to test. This is what I'm going to test the batches for. These are the limits I'm going to apply. These are the acceptance criteria I'm setting. And as an assessor, we can review that strategy. We can ask questions. We can help them to refine the strategy before they've implemented it. And we can agree with them, with the industry, what exactly we expect to be generated to support this change. So when that first part of the protocol is approved, there's absolute clarity for the industry and the regulator about this future change, what's intended to be done, and what we expect to be submitted. And then once they implement the change, they make their 3 batches, they generate the results, they can submit a notification to us, a type 1A, to say, I've done what I said, I've met all the criteria you predefined, and now I'm implementing my new manufacturing site. So the second step can be very quick. It can be done by a notification because the assessment has been done up front of the strategy. So in that step 1 document, what we'd expect to see is a description of the proposed changes, the risk management activities to be performed, the proposed studies and the acceptance criteria to assess the impact of the change. And we approve this as a regulator in advance of execution. Then the step 2 of the protocol, the company implements the change. They gather the generated data and results. If they meet the acceptance criteria of the protocol, it's a very straightforward notification. They're basically saying to the regulator, I've done what we have agreed. My results are in line with the predefined acceptance criteria. Therefore, I'm implementing this change. And as a regulator, we don't need to assess that in detail. We've already assessed the detail in the step 1. So now the step 2 is the confirmatory step to say this change is approvable and implementable. So this is an example of the benefits of a change management protocol. So if we look across the top in the grey box, this is the traditional approach for the site transfer. So you have the construction and qualification of the new manufacturing site. Then you go into production, where you're manufacturing at the new site, you're generating your data, you have your GMP approval process, your inspections are happening. Then once you have all the data from your production, you submit a type 2 variation for review, which would take 4 to 6 months with questions and answers, etc. You get the approval, and then you can ship the product. So that's when we follow the traditional approach to site transfer. You wait until all data is available, industry make the variation submission, and then in that assessment procedure, we assess everything, the strategy, the results, everything. If the same change is managed using a change management protocol, you can see that while the site is in construction and qualification, and before the production has started, the MA holder can already submit a change management protocol step 1 to say, this is what we're currently doing, this is what we intend to do, these are the batch and stability data we intend to generate in our new manufacturing site. The step 1 protocol can be approved early in the timeline, and then the industry, the manufacturer, goes and does their production and generates the data. So then, at the same time as they would normally be submitting the full data package, now they just need to submit a notification, and this is at the bottom here, a Type 1B 30-day notification to supply these results. And because we've already done the critical assessment early in the process, while they're still in the planning phase, we can have a pared down and a more risk proportionate step 2 to the protocol. And this is based on a real example from a pharma company who were contributing to the ICH Q12 guideline drafting group. In this case, this particular example, they got a 5 months faster approval of the site change by using the protocol. So by using a change management protocol, they managed to get the product to patients 5 months earlier than they would have if they waited and submitted a variation in the traditional way. So the use of protocols to decouple the steps of the planning and the data generation, and to give earlier feedback to the manufacturer, will absolutely facilitate faster approval timelines. And we're seeing change management protocols being used a lot more in the last years, and especially, for example, with some of the vaccines and therapeutics during COVID, we're seeing these tools being used to expedite approval and availability. There are a number of annexes in the Q12 guideline, 2 examples on change management protocols, so I'd encourage you to take time to have a look at the annex of the Q12 guideline. The next chapter, chapter 5, it deals with the product lifecycle management. This is a document within the dossier for tracking established conditions and reporting categories. It's a living document that's designed as a communication tool between assessors and inspectors and the pharma company. So we can have a snapshot in time to see what exactly is the current state of the product life cycle. It's a central repository. It enables planning and implementing future changes to established conditions in a predictable manner, and most importantly, it provides transparency and facilitates continual improvement. It's generally a tabular format document, and it should be located in the regional part of Module 3 in most regions. So in the EU, we'd expect it. It would probably need to come into the regional section. In Japan, it's similar to their approval letter. It can be placed in Module 1. So it's flexible, I think, in terms of the CTD structure currently, where the PLCM could be. ICH M4Q, the CTD structure, is currently under revision, and they will formally define a location for the PLCM in that future CTD structure. Maintenance of the PLCM is really important. It needs to be kept up to date. If it's to be a useful tool for assessors and inspectors, it needs to be up to date, and it needs to be clear what the current state of approved established conditions and future reporting categories will be. This is what a PLCM looks like. So if we go back to our last example of the diffusion blender, we can see here you have the CTD section where the established condition is contained. You have the established condition defined, and then in the last column, whether a change to this established condition would trigger a variation and what category of variation it would be. Okay, so let's move on now to the quality system. And the pharmaceutical quality system of the manufacturer is a really key part of lifecycle management. The quality system and quality risk management principles are defined in a number of ICH guidelines, Q9 and 10 and Q7. In order to support the use of Q12 tools, so for effective change management, we need to have a quality system that's effective and in line with ICH Q10. And quality systems should also be in compliance with regional GMP requirements. So it's all fine to say you should have a categorization system, you can use established conditions, change management protocols, but these tools are only effective if the industry that's using them have a functioning and compliant quality system. So this is the slide we saw earlier about the PQS. We have the product lifecycle across the top where the GMP comes in, and the elements of the PQS listed below, and the important things underpinning a good and effective change management system are knowledge management, quality risk management, and management review. So as I mentioned, if you want to use these tools of Q12, they have to be within a functioning and effective PQS. And this is where our colleagues in the inspectorate come in, and their role is absolutely crucial here in confirming that a manufacturing site and an MA holder has a mature and effective pharmaceutical quality system that can effectively manage change and can effectively communicate change both within the manufacturing network between different manufacturers and the MA holder and with the regulator. On this slide you see two parts. The grey part is the internal company process. The red part is what we do in assessment in the regulatory authority. So we can see within the company we have a lot happening in terms of change management and knowledge management. You have a stimulus for a change. So, you know, in that example, we need to tighten our assay limit. Why? Well, maybe something's happened in production, or maybe we've seen a trend over time. Change evaluation, the company has to do a risk-based assessment, look at the data from their historical batches, look at their development data and say, okay, how will we go about this change? Initiate their internal change approval. We are going to make this change. We're going to tighten our specifications. And then they need to consider, do we need to communicate this change to the regulator? And is it a prior approval or notification? So in that example we had of a tightening of specifications, it has lower risk, so they can implement the change and send the notification to the regulator. This cycle continues with knowledge management. They need to monitor their production. They need to feed back from their pharmaceutical development functions and their testing functions into their production and reg affairs. And this cycle of knowledge management and change management happens and should continue to happen all the time. If they come across problems, they need to perform investigations, corrective and preventative actions to correct problems when they arise. So this is all happening in the manufacturing site, within the pharmaceutical company, and in an effective PQS, this is happening all the time. This is a continuous cycle of knowledge management and change management. What we need to know as regulators in the red is when a change gets to that point where it's to be implemented, what is the risk that this change poses to quality, and does it require communication to the regulator, and at what level? Is it a prior approval? Is it a notification before or after the change? We can only, as assessors, rely on the established conditions, the variations, the change management protocols that we see in this red piece. We can only rely on that if we have confidence that the grey piece is working. And that's where our GMP inspectorate comes in, because the GMP inspectors are the ones who can go to the sites, who can observe change management processes, observe the PQS functioning day to day, and can say, yes, this quality system is compliant with EU GMP, and the knowledge management and change management processes are robust and are functioning well. And that then gives us the confidence as assessors to accept that we are seeing the communications at the right level, whether they're notifications or prior approval. So managing the supply chain, you know, supply chains these days are much more complex than they used to be. So you have the MA holder who's coordinating everything. You have manufacturers of raw materials, of active substances, excipients, finished products. you have your R&D, pharmaceutical development organizations, you have your suppliers, your packaging components, all your raw materials that are coming in, and then you may have other contract manufacturers performing packaging operations, testing, logistics. A problem at any one of these actors could have an impact on the final product quality. If something happens in one supplier, that can have an impact on your product quality. If something happens in one packaging site, that can have an impact on your product quality. And the MA holder is the one sitting above all of this with their quality system. And what we need as regulators is confidence that the MA holder, the manufacturers, everyone within this supply chain have a good knowledge management system, communication channels, and clear quality risk management principles embedded into everything that they do. So, another Slido. This one, I'm going to ask about your setup in your country. Where are your quality assessors and GMP inspectors employed and located? So, are your assessors and inspectors in the same agency and in the same location? Are they in the same agency but in different locations? Or are your assessors and inspectors in different agencies and different locations? So once again, the Slido code is on the slide, and if you're on the WebEx, you can log in and answer the Slido question directly. So we're up to 90 responses here. Okay, and we can see we have about 70% of respondents are saying that their assessors and inspectors are in the same agency and working from the same location. We've around 20% say they're in different agencies and locations, and a smaller amount in the same agency and different locations. So I think from that we can see 75% of assessors and inspectors are in the same agency, and 25% are in different agencies. This is really important because, as I said on the last on that last slide, the communication between quality assessors and GMP inspectors is absolutely crucial to effective lifecycle management and for sharing of information. It's easier to do when you're located in the same agency and in the same building. Those interactions happen quite organically, and you know, you can pick up the phone, you can walk to someone's desk, you can connect via Teams, etc. Where it becomes more challenging is where you're located in different agencies or different locations, and there you really need to work to put structures in place to facilitate the communication and the collaboration between assessors and inspectors. So next slide, please. On average, how often do you interact as quality assessors and inspectors? So if you're a quality assessor, how often do you talk to a GMP inspector? Every day? Once a week? Once per month? Once per year? Or maybe you've never spoken to a GMP inspector. So thanks for your replies. I think this is very interesting. So we have around 40% saying once per month is the average. We have around 20% saying never. 11% once per year, 11% less often. And we have 20% basically saying every day or every week. So this, I mean, for me, this is really important. This is really telling, and it's something we need to reflect on as quality assessors and as GMP inspectors. Are we supporting each other? Are we sharing information? Are we helping each other to do their job? Because actually, we're all part of the same team. We're all regulators. We're all interested in the regulation of medicines and in the protection of public health. So it's something to reflect on. Are we spending enough time interacting? Do we have systems in place where assessors and inspectors are coming together and working together routinely? So if I get the next slide then. And this is the message I want to give. Assessment and inspection are complementary activities. Although their fundamental roles are different, effective communication between assessors and inspectors can facilitate regulatory oversight. So we need to have appropriate mechanisms to share knowledge and information of our respective activities, because this can mitigate increased submission burden. An inspection conclusion available for me as an assessor helps me understand the background to a change and the compliance history of the site. If an inspector is going to a site to inspect, wouldn't it be good to talk to your assessor in advance, take a copy of a change management protocol or a PLCM, or ask, has there been any tricky variations in the last year? Is there a particular analytical method you've had a problem with? Is there something you want me to look at? And that helps the inspectors to focus on areas of higher risk. So that was an hour and 10 minutes that we've gotten through. I'm going to go back to the start now to this daunting slide that I showed with these acronyms and tools and names and lots of arrows and pointy things, which probably didn't make the most sense. I hope after an hour and 10 minutes that you can look at this slide and at least know what the acronyms stand for, and maybe have an idea as to how these tools interrelate to each other. My most important message I want to give is that green bit at the bottom, the quality system. The industry are managing change every day. Some are doing it very well. Some are probably not doing it as well and could improve. And us as a team of assessors and inspectors, our job is to maintain the adequate oversight and to drive continual improvement and to ensure that the medicines that patients receive are of consistent and appropriate quality. This is the last slide, which is even more complicated with even more arrows and more pointy bits, which I was afraid to show you at the start. But I think now, after the last hour and 10 minutes, hopefully you can look at this slide and it will make some sense to you. You can see as an assessor or an inspector where you sit in these diagrams and which aspects of lifecycle management you can influence and regulate. So these were the learning objectives at the start. I hope we've managed to touch on them, and I think we'll open the floor now for questions and discussion. So back to you, Ivo.
No, thank you very much, Brian, for what I would see as a brilliant presentation. You condensed an awful lot of info and an awful complex document, ICH Q12, into a 1-hour presentation, presented in a very comprehensive way. And obviously, 1 hour is way too short to deal with all this. And I can understand that the audience in the room, it's a lot of information to process if you're not aware of it. But given the fact that we are dealing with a very heterogeneous audience here, I think it was really good. I have seen, whilst you were talking, that there's at least one comment in one question in the chat. We've got some time for questions and discussions. It will eat into our coffee break. So for that, I would also give the opportunity to people online first to ask questions, because people here in the room have the opportunity to approach Brian, and he will be available to answer your questions also during coffee break. And and over the next 2 days, I trust if there are questions. So with that, I'm opening the chat. There was one question from Sylvia Carstoio. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the question here is: always site transfer a type 2 variation, or can it be a 1B grouped variation? So, question for you, Brian.
Thanks for your question, Sylvia. And the answer is it depends. It depends on the risk posed by this site transfer. So if it's a manufacturing process, a standard manufacturing process, say a tableting manufacturing process, to a site which is already GMP compliant, those type of changes would be a type 1B. What you see the higher risk changes if it's a biological process, maybe it's for a vaccine or for an advanced therapy medicinal product. Those site transfers would carry much higher risk because of the variability that's inherent in those manufacturing processes. So those type of site transfers would always be a type 2 variation. So it really depends on the risk posed by the particular change. What a company can do, though, is register a change management protocol via a type 2 variation and then implement that site transfer via a type 1B. So the change management protocol can be used as a tool to downgrade the variation, the implementing variation. So that's one option. We've had complex site transfers managed by change management protocol where it's implemented as a type 1B variation because you de-risk the change by performing the assessment up front in the step 1 of the protocol. So then you can have a lower category for the implementing variation.
So can I ask you a question, Brian? So for that risk-based approach to determine what type of variation it is, are there any preset requirements, or is it at the judgment of the regulator in this case?
Well, in the EU, we have our variation classification guideline, which is very detailed in terms of clearly setting out the default categories, I'd say, for change management. So by default, a new biological site will be a type 2. Now, within the change management protocol, the company can come and say, we've been manufacturing monoclonal antibodies for 20 years. This site has already had 4 antibodies transferred into it. This is our plan. This is how many batches we'll do. These are our test methods. They lay out everything they intend to do and their implementation strategy. The assessors then need to assess that and say, okay, based on everything they've said here, is it reasonable that their implementing variation could be a lower category of type 1B? And that exists within our framework that we can define the implementing variation to be a lower category. So that's the assessor's decision. They may assess the protocol and say, you know, your knowledge management isn't sufficient here. There's a lot of unknowns, variability. I'm not convinced that you've de-risked this. So actually, we reject the protocol and we want to see a full type 2 when you implement the change. So that's firmly within the assessor, the regulator's decision.
Okay, thank you. I see no one raising a hand online or in the chat, no questions. So I'm looking at the room right now. Any requests for clarification? Serbia, please, on that side.
Thank you, Pavle Zelic from Serbian Medicines Medical Devices Agency, and it's such a pleasure to be here in this room. I was here actually just before the pandemic, so I remember it well. I would just come back for a comment on something that was actually on the very last slide. I think it's very important for us here, and once again, I think it's an example that we can share about communication between regulators across regions is encouraged. So maybe flesh out a little bit how you think this conclusion recommendation could be implemented, and we see it obviously right here, right now, but a little bit more details about this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think Martin, as our head of international affairs, would be well placed to answer this, but I can answer as a quality assessor. I mean, we have a number of different forums. ICH is a forum we work in on guideline development. ICMRA is a coalition of medicines regulators where we're looking at more of the practical things. So for example, in ICMRA at the moment, there's a pilot ongoing for change management protocols. across regions where we have EU, FDA, Japan, Canada assessing change management protocols together, sharing the assessment, sharing conclusions, working towards harmonized outcomes. On the inspection side, we have PICS, which is the global Association of GMP Inspectors. PICS published a document on PQS effectiveness and change management a few years ago, which is an aid memoir for GMP inspectors going to sites, what to look for in a quality system when you're assessing effective change management. So the inspectors have their fora in PICS. As assessors, we're in ICH, we're supporting ICMRA. Events like this today, I think, are really important. We also have a number of bilateral interactions with our colleagues, say in FDA in Japan. We have liaison officers there. So I think it's true to say the world is getting smaller, and certainly as regulators, we're working more and more together. And certainly in the area of quality and inspections, I think there's a lot of very good initiatives ongoing, and I'd encourage you, if possible, to get involved in those, because they're real benefit.
The only one to add to that, Brian, would be the IPRP, the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Platform. That also is a regulators only forum, and that is also working on this area. The PICS Training Academy is also receiving funding from ICH to provide training programs on the sorts of areas that Brian has just been talking about. So there are many opportunities that are funded training opportunities to engage with.
Okay, thank you for that and that addition, Martin. Any other questions from the room or online?